album art which results in such a glorious YouTube thumbnail, and the fact that it costs me absolutely nothing, I had every motivation to want to click on Rhinoceros by Rhinoceros from 1968, 40 odd minutes later. It's a lot of fun. It's less of a psychedelic jam album and more of a rootsy blues rock Americana album with some psychedelic rock touches. It has more in common with an American blues rock act than what you might expect. You say a Jefferson Airplane with a Doors or 13th Floor Elevators or whomever you want to name, Iron Butterfly. Unfortunately, this album art, or maybe the fact that not enough of it was pressed, or for whatever reason, this just did not sell in 1968, much to the chagrin of the record label. Let's read about the history of the group Rhinoceros. This album tends to be considered apparently a bit of a disappointment by those who are seeking a psychedelic rock classic, although I happen to think it's an extremely entertaining, having no expectations of it. I knew it wasn't considered as good as its album art, and so I went into it. I was very, very pleasantly surprised by it. Very entertaining, I think. If you like 60s rock, give it a go. I was reading ratings of the release as I was listening to it initially and thinking it deserved some finer praise than it may have received initially. Anyway, the history of the group. Rhinoceros was an American rock band established in 1967 through auditions conducted by Elektra Records rather than organic formation by musicians. The band, while well respected in many circles, did not live up to the record label's expectations. It was also poorly received by fans, producing a slow-selling debut album and two even less successful LPs before breaking up. One reviewer commented, despite the fact that the band could not live up to the expectations that were raised by Elektra Records' publicity machine, Rhinoceros' contributions to rock still deserve more credit than subsequent rock histories give it. Paul A. Rothschild, then Elektra Records' talent scout and house producer, and fellow producer Fraser Mohawk, formerly Barry Friedman, decided to individually sign talented young musicians and form them together into a group in this fashion. While Mohawk had been instrumental in coordinating band membership for what became Buffalo Springfield, encouraging Stills to form Buffalo Springfield following his Monkees audition, the establishment of what became Rhinoceros involved a more formal third-party role. Rothschild and Mohawk initially invited 12 musicians to audition in September 1967 at Mohawk's house in Laurel Canyon. Included in this initial group were Doug Hastings, guitar, and Alan Gerber, keyboards and vocals. A second audition was held at a Los Angeles motel in November 1967, where approximately 20 musicians were reviewed. After this meeting, John Finley, vocals, and Danny Wise, guitar, were chosen to work with Hastings and Gerber. Finley and Hodgson were both former members of John and Lee and the Checkmates, a band which Rothschild had expressed an interest in signing as early as 1965 that had broken up in September 1967. Wise had been an original member of Iron Butterfly and played on their debut album. Hastings had been a member of Seattle's The Daily Flash and briefly served as Neil Young's replacement in Buffalo Springfield during one of Young's departures from the group. Other members of The Daily Flash were invited to audition for Rhinoceros, but only Hastings was chosen. Wise then suggested former Iron Butterfly bandmate Jerry Penrod as the bass player for Rhinoceros. His suggestion was accepted. Former Checkmate keyboard player Michael Fonfara was then invited to join the lineup. Fonfara had joined the Electric Flag in mid-November 1967 for sessions and a brief tour of the Northeast US and California. During mid-December, he ran into Finley and Hodgson at the Tropicana Motel in Los Angeles and was encouraged by Finley to sign onto the Rhinoceros project. Based on Finley's recommendation, Fonfara was brought into Rhinoceros following the completion of his obligations to the Electric Flag. John Calahor, former drummer for the Daily Flash, contributed to some of the group's early recordings but departed early on. The final member chosen in early 1968 was Billy Mundy, former drummer for the Mothers of Invention. The band first recorded together as the backing musicians for David Ackles' debut album, released in 1968. Rhinoceros' self-titled debut album, produced by Paul Rothschild, was also released in 1968. Despite heavy promotion and critical acclaim, it did not sell well. However, the instrumental Apricot Brandy, written by Weiss and Fonfara, reached number 46 on the Billboard charts and was later used as a signature tune by BBC Radio and covered by Danny Gatton for the 1990 compilation Rubaiyat. Another of the album's songs, I Will Serenade You, written by John Findlay, was covered by Free Dog Night as Let Me Serenade You and went to number 17 in the US in 1973. In addition, their cover of You're My Girl, I Don't Want to Discuss It was covered in 1969 by Amen Corner on their National Welsh Coast Live Explosion Company album, and in 1970 by Rod Stewart on his Gasoline Alley album. I Will Serenade You was the debut single of Rhinoceros in the United States, while You're My Girl was the debut single in the United Kingdom, both being released in 1968. Both songs were released on the same single, with each song being the B-side of the other, depending on the country of release. The next 2 years saw many changes of the lineup and 2 more albums. From the time of their second album, Satin Chickens, 1969, Rothschild and Mohawk were no longer involved with production. The album was instead produced by David Anderl. Bassist Jerry Penrod abruptly departed from the band after the album's completion. He was briefly replaced by Danny Weiss' brother Steve, and later by Finley's cousin and former bandmate in John and Lee and the Checkmates, Peter Hodgson. Hodgson had lost out to Jerry Penrod in the initial auditions, and had then joined David Clayton Thomas in Toronto for his David Clayton Thomas Combine. He later returned to Los Angeles to work with Jackson Browne before finally joining Rhinoceros in April 1969. 3 more band members would leave before the recording of the third album. First was guitarist Doug Hastings, who left that summer to be replaced by another checkmate, Larry Leishman, who had played with Freedom Fair and the Power Project until mid-1968, and then with Bobby Chris and the Imperials. This is like a Spinal Tap backstory. This is ridiculous. A bit later, Alan Gerber left the band due to disagreements over band manager Billy Field's decision to not have them perform at Woodstock. Holy fuck, this is his fucking Spinal Tap of the late 60s, Christ. Billy Mundy would follow him shortly after. The 2 roles of singer and drummer were taken up by the Checkmates manager-drummer Duke Edwards, who had also played with Rhinoceros newcomer Leishman in the Duke Edwards Cycle in early 1969. The lineup of John Finley vocals, Danny Weiss guitars, Michael Fonfara organ, Peter Hodgson bass, Larry Leishman guitars, and Duke Edwards drums vocals, moved to New York and recorded the third and last Rhinoceros album, Better Times Are Coming, in 1970. Then the band did some shows at Fillmore East, after which Edwards was replaced by Dr. John drummer Richard Crooks, who in turn would be replaced by Malcolm Tomlinson, who stayed with the band until their dissolution before mid-1971. In 1971, after the breakup of Rhinoceros, John Finley, Michael Fonfara, Peter Hodgson, Danny Weiss, and Larry Leishman formed a new group called Blackstone, later referred to by Weiss as an attempt to recapture some of the fun we had in Rhinoceros. They recorded an album for Canadian label GRT, produced by Paul Rothschild. The musicians then went their separate ways. I think it's a fun album, and that's the story of Rhinoceros. Solid debut, I think. It's fun if you know what to expect. That's what I'll say here. If you give it a try, I hope you dig it.